my screen. Okay, David and I tested out the audio, but I apologize if it's a little loud for people. We'll play it twice when we get there. But I'm coming in with an assumption that aphasia is not that well known amongst most of the people here. If that assumption is wrong, that's totally fine, but hopefully this will be some useful information for some of you. So I'm going to spend some time today talking about work that's all exclusively in aphasia. I do other things. I work in dementia and traumatic brain injury and typical aging as well, but I thought for a cohesive story, it might be fun to stick with aphasia. Idan knows this, but and Melody I see here too knows this, but my particular interest is moving from really experimentally restrained tasks to less experimentally restrained tasks. I have a few reasons for doing so, which I'll highlight on the next slide. But this is the fun graphic I always show all the students who come to my lab and ask why we do what we do. And that's we're going from a domesticated to a very wild environment of language. So trying to work from all of the tasks that have given us a fantastic view of psycholinguistics, which are single word, single sentence repetition, to a less structured but more naturalistic environment that a lot of linguistics has moved towards, but less so in my field of communication sciences. So during this talk, I'll talk a little bit about some of the studies we've done looking at this middle section, which is the more structured section where it's more monologue discourse, but it's allowing people to draw on some other cognitive resources like memory, semantic memory, episodic memory, amongst other things. That gives us a more comprehensive view of what's going on in terms of their language abilities as well as their impairments. So I came to this area of interest from starting my PhD 8 or 9 years ago and being thrown into the world of aphasia. My PhD advisor was a stroke neurologist who focused in aphasia, and I began talking to a lot of these individuals. I began shadowing speech language therapists, and I noticed that there was a really narrow focus on what we consider to be language and communication in these individuals. Typically, most studies you see that are treatment or assessment focus on naming only if they're looking at language production. They don't generally go to storytelling or things that are, as I say, a little bit more in the wild, but the things that are more natural in how we communicate as a human society. And that's because it's hard to measure those things and it's difficult to find good tasks. So I've set out to say, what can we learn from doing these more complicated tasks? How can we be better at it? And how can that actually inform, how we assess and treat individuals who have these disorders? So that's where I come from. So that's a little bit more about why I focus in this area. So I'll kind of highlight 3 different studies that are going on in my lab. One is bridging the gap between naming and discourse. So highly constrained, a little bit less constrained. This is what David mentioned, actually. This is the stuff that was published in Cortex. And then going to a bit more recent, looking at linguistic structure, so linguistic variables and how those differ by discourse tasks. So really sticking to discourse, not comparing with naming. And then recent work in my lab over the past year or so is focused on how gesture can add to what we know about language and what is basically still in someone's language system in terms of individuals with aphasia. So that's where we're going. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about aphasia. It's estimated to affect about 2 million in the US right now. Those are the best estimates. It's a pretty common stroke outcome for left hemisphere stroke, especially left middle cerebral artery stroke. Language impairment is the primary symptom, which can affect all aspects of language or be selective toward one of them. But it typically also coincides with speech impairments like dysarthria or apraxia of speech, and other cognitive impairments as well, attention, executive function, for example, episodic memory, semantic memory. Aphasia is incredibly useful for us as a model because it allows us to really explore a few different questions, which I've tried to highlight down here. You can explore some of these ideas of what brain structures are necessary, or you can even grow that and say what networks are necessary to support a function, which allows us to really explore things in a little bit more detail than some of the, well, in addition to some of the great work that's happening in healthy aging. how language interacts with other cognitive processes, and then how nonverbal communication really comes to play, because you'll see at the end that individuals with aphasia really do rely on nonverbal communication as well. So we typically classify aphasia, vascular aphasia, I should say, because there's also primary progressive aphasia, which is the result of dementia. So I'm talking about vascular stroke-caused aphasias. Typically, we characterize them as being more expressive, so the issue is more with a production, more receptive, the issue is more with an intake. It can be a mix of both, and typically repetition, depending on the subtype, might also be impaired. I'll give you two examples, which you've probably heard in intro psych courses, but I like to kind of paint a picture to make sure we're all on the same page. But the shared disorder, or shared, I should say, symptom amongst all types of aphasia is anomia, or an issue with lexical retrieval. So almost every type shares that. These are some of the individuals that I scanned throughout my past few years doing this. My background's in neuroscience as well as kind of communication sciences and disorders. So I do a lot of fMRI, functional or diffusion imaging, as well as structural scans. So these are just some T1 images that have had the skulls removed, so you can see their different middle cerebral artery strokes. It's really heterogeneous. You guys all know that the vascular system is not particularly well suited to knock out a single structure by itself. So typically within a aphasia subtype, you're going to get lots of different impairment and severities, and then across aphasia subtypes, they're going to be very different too. So these are just some examples of individuals that we've scanned in our lab. So let's listen really quickly just to get us in the state of mind. So one classic type that people think of when they think of aphasia is an aphasia affecting production. The most common type of that is Broca's aphasia. So as you listen to this, have a listen for simple syntax. So really active sentences, not a lot of inflection happening, largely a use of nouns in this person's case, labored speech, which could be indicative of some other speech problems, but in this person's case is just a lexical retrieval issue, some word searching behaviors, and then also pay attention to how well he is comprehending the interviewer too. That's important. I'm gonna hopefully skip a little bit here.
Can you tell us your name?
Is that too loud? A little loud. Hold on. David cringed, so.
Mike Caputo.
And Mike, when was your stroke?
I was 7 years ago.
Okay.
And
what did you used to do?
Worked Autodesk, sales and worldwide, and very good. Yeah.
Okay. And who are you looking at over there when you turn your head?
That's my wife.
Okay. And what?
So hopefully that's a good indication. He's got really retained comprehension from an auditory point of view. He understands what the interviewer is saying. He's going to answer pretty quickly, but he's making some errors. He almost said 7 when he meant sales, and his sentences are really, really simple. He doesn't use a whole lot of complicated grammar or a whole lot of verbs for that matter. So that's someone who's indicative of having Broca's aphasia. You can contrast that person with someone who has the other side, which is largely a receptive impairment, has an issue understanding. As a result, typically they produce speech that's kind of meaningless. We call it empty speech. So as you listen to this individual, listen to how he's responding to the questions, and also how he's, what types of words he's using and whether or not they're on target with what's being asked. It's subtle, but he also misuses some grammar, which we call paragrammatism. So you can see if you pick up on that. This one's a little quieter, so. Come on.
Hi, Byron. How are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
That's a really good example of how he wasn't quite sure what she was meaning by iPad there, right? He's looking out, clearly looking outside, trying to see where they're going, not what we're doing with the iPad. And he's also using very, very vague words, lots of him, them, not a lot of concrete words to tell us what he's talking about. So it's pretty hard, I think, unless she had said the word cruise, to understand that he was trying to talk about a cruise. So those are two instances of aphasia. And this is a little plug. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about discourse and aphasia, I help co-run a working group if you'd like to pop in and join us. Okay, so let's jump in. The first thing I wanted to do is contrast naming and discourse. My area that I absolutely love is looking at paraphasias or word errors. I think it's fascinating. And so I wanted to ask the question, to what extent do word errors differ between naming and discourse? If they don't differ, why does it matter that we look at discourse if we're caring about word errors, right? Let's just look at naming. And we also, of course, everything I do, I like to look at the brain, and I made the assumption that even if they're producing different frequencies of errors, the same type of an error, like a semantic error, should arise from a shared pattern of brain damage, regardless of the task that they're doing, right? Because that's a neurobiology of language, right? It should arise from an area that makes sense. So what we did is we took a lot of participants from the aphasia lab at South Carolina, where I did my postdoc. They all had chronic aphasia. Everyone here we talk about is chronic, and that means 6 months post-stroke in our case. That's just to make sure that their language abilities and impairments are kind of settled. So it's not just fluctuations like you'd see in the acute stage. We had them do a naming task. It's a pretty popular one, the Philadelphia naming test, just a bunch of objects. And then we had them describe 3 pictures to us. Some of those individuals did both tasks. There were about 40 of them, but some had data for only one. So when we were comparing the paraphasias between the two, we're looking at the slightly smaller group. Those of you who work with clinical populations can understand why this happens, but we try our best. So what we did is we categorized the paraphasias by hand. It's really the best way at the moment to do it. There has not been a great automatic tagging system invented yet to deal with aphasic speech. If you know of one, let me know, would love to see it. But until then, we're working by hand. So I've given you some examples here. On the right, you can see a typical transcript. This is how we code it using chat code, which is by Brian McWhinney's group and TalkBank. And then over here, I've just given you some examples of paraphasias we were looking at for the current study. So semantically related and unrelated are the two I'm going to focus on. So semantically related is when you're in the right semantic category for what you meant to say, but you just missed. So they meant to say lion, this is the target, but they said tiger instead. Unrelated, on the other hand, is a real word, but not related to what they meant to say. It's nice to have picture descriptions and naming because you know what they're trying to say. When you get a little deeper into some of these more open-ended things, like tell me about your life, it's a little bit harder to identify targets because you're not quite sure what they're trying to tell you. So it's a little bit nicer with these tasks. We can get a higher rate of reliability between raters. Not unexpectedly, and yay for me, we actually do see a different distribution of paraphasias based on a naming versus a discourse task, which tells us that they're probably, and we know this, relying on different linguistic and cognitive mechanisms, right? Discourse is probably a little bit more difficult. You have syntax built in, you've got a lot of competitive phonological and semantic neighbors happening. It's not surprising that the paraphasia distributions are different, and that's what we see. So we see more unrelated paraphasias and fewer semantically related paraphasias during our discourse tasks. I have a few thoughts about that in a second, but we're not the only ones to show this. I think we just did it in a sample that happened to also have brain scans. But my 2 colleagues, so Laura Murray, you can see down there, and then Gerasimos Fergadiotis have also looked at this and have shown a very similar thing where the distributions are different, which for me is important, telling us that these 2 tasks can help us learn a bit more about what's going on with someone's language system. Brain-wise, we looked at the 2 groups that were slightly larger who had data for either connected speech or the PNT. Their lesion maps were not different, so we thought we could compare the 2 groups. So what you see on the right is just a conjunction analysis. It's the area of shared damage that semantically and unrelated paraphasia is associated with. This is voxel-wise lesion symptom mapping, so just looking at areas of tissue that are damaged and seeing how, well, the assumption is that more damage will lead to a worse behavior, in this case, more paraphasias. That's the assumption behind this. And what we find is anterior and middle temporal gyrus on the left side correlates with verbal paraphasias regardless of task, which makes a lot of sense considering what we know about the language model, which you can see really here. This is a brand new paper using MEG to look at language timing in terms of, this is actually naming, but it makes sense in terms of discourse as well. You can see the left MTG there is lexical retrieval, which is basically the process that both of these verbal paraphasias are sharing. So it makes sense that they both associate with this, even though the frequencies by task are different. I think the behavior finding is the most interesting, at least for me, because we are figuring out that we need to do a gamut of experimental tasks to really get a handle on how paraphasias might change if you are looking at more natural language. So this was the first study for me that really solidified why I found this interesting and pushed me to keep looking for more. So hopefully in the next few slides, you'll see why I do that. But I thought I could just have a little, oh yeah, and I forgot to highlight this, but it also helps to highlight some of the, there's a temporal lobe gradient that's been hypothesized by a few individuals based on lexical and semantic selection, and we felt like our results lined up fairly well with that. And that's a really great paper if you are interested. So I thought I'd stop for questions based on any of those before jumping into this next one. So I'll let David let me know if there's anything in the chat.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of these lesions are pretty close to the auditory cortex. Do they also have hearing impairments and other sort of things?
They're pretty lateral, typically. They don't necessarily, they're not medial enough to knock out basic hearing, but they definitely, especially the individuals who have Wernicke's aphasia and more receptive types, do have damage to that unimodal hearing cortex. And so we do test basic hearing and basic like minimal pairs discrimination, sound discrimination before we test them on anything else. But for production wise, we don't look too detailed into hearing, I have to say. But for comprehension work, you absolutely have to.
Thanks.
Yeah, Idan can probably talk to you all about that. But we do not typically have that many individuals who present with damage to like Heschel's gyrus. It's more like unimodal superior temporal gyrus in terms of our lesions that we get. Any other questions? Okay. So hopefully this next one will logically follow, and this is focusing more within now that area of discourse, right? So we know it's a little bit different in terms of the linguistic and cognitive load that it requires. And so individuals with aphasia are going to perform differently on this task than they do on naming tasks. So now we're going to hone in a little bit on the discourse tasks. And there are tons and tons of tasks that people have done and published on in the literature. Discourse has been incredibly well researched in linguistics, less well in communicative sciences, but honestly, the aphasia world associates with discourse back until probably the 70s. So it's been around for a long time, but individuals have largely focused on those picture description tasks. So I wanted to ask myself, what are the task effects on linguistic structure within discourse, right? And why does that matter? So I paired up with a colleague here at IU. Her name's Julia Fukuyama. She's in the Department of Statistics, and her specialty area is in dimension reduction using multivariate techniques. So we paired together to really work on this question. We harnessed Aphasia Bank, which is a part of the TalkBank project, which has now over 300 different speakers with aphasia. All of their data is transcribed fully, like the little snippet I showed you earlier. They do a pretty long battery of discourse tasks, as well as some naming tasks, some comprehension tasks, some sentence repetition tasks. And there's also about 200 neurotypical controls in there who are prospectively kind of age matched based on our individuals with aphasia. The cool thing about this database is that there's tons of different types of tasks that require different cognitive and linguistic mechanisms behind them. So for instance, one task, actually two of them, require autobiographical narratives. We ask them to tell us about their important event in their life and to also tell us about what they remember about having their stroke and recovering from their stroke. We asked them to retell us the story of Cinderella. Idan will probably laugh because the story haunts me in my sleep. I've been doing it for like 8 years now. If I ever have children, I'm never going to show them Cinderella because I've heard so many retellings, but we give them a wordless picture book and then they retell us what they remember about it and also any details they know from any other time they've seen it. We ask them to tell us how to make a sandwich, which we call a procedural narrative. And then the last thing is we do have them describe just pictures that are static, as well as sequences of pictures. And those are called descriptive narratives. Some people will call them expository if you explain more about it, but for the purposes of this, we'll call them descriptive. So what we wanted to do is look a little bit at structure. We're not looking at how communicative these people were, how much sense they made, how functional their language was. We're just looking at structure of language as a first pass. And by that, I mean word classes that they used, parts of speech that they used, and morphosyntactic forms that they used, like tense. And we just wanted to see how different those were by task, because if those are different, you're probably going to have pretty different information in terms of function too. So this was kind of our first pass. So we found in the neurotypical sample that tasks really did cluster together by linguistic structure. So if you look over to the right, let me use my little magnifying glass. Up here, you can see how they dimensionally reduced. It's basically the word class on the y-axis and kind of morphosyntax on the x. The sandwich task is the procedural narrative. It's the only one of its kind, and it also loads pretty differently from the other tasks. The blue tasks were the autobiographical and the story tasks, and the green were the ones that involved them telling about the picture, the more descriptive tasks. So you can see pretty clearly, hopefully, that the tasks are kind of dissociating by genre, for lack of a better word. And that's in neurotypical adults. In adults with aphasia, you see a very, very similar thing, but it's a little bit less clear. So let me scroll in here. In the individuals who have the least severe aphasia, they actually don't test as having aphasia on this battery that we use called the WOB, but they still have word finding issues. They look a lot like the controls. Their tasks dissociate more, but those individuals who have more severe impairment, thinking of BROCA'S aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, their tasks don't dissociate as well. And there is also more heterogeneity within the members of that group, which you can hopefully see by the bigger circles here. So what that's telling us is that there's probably something going on with aphasia type and severity that's mediating this relationship of language structure and task. We looked at that a little bit more here, which you can see. We just took the average distance in the full language space, not the dimensionally reduced space. We said, what's the average distance between tasks for these individuals? For controls, it's the widest, but the group that's pretty close to the control group, the least severe group, had a similar task difference. And as you kind of go down toward these different aphasia types that typically are more severe, you see that the tasks are getting closer together in terms of their centroids. Julia also did a really cool analysis where she did a PCA looking at the difference between severity and trying to tease apart if it's type or severity that matters more, and that explains more about these task differences. And she found that it was a little bit more severity than type. So the more severe your language was affected, the more your tasks were closer together in structure. They looked similar in terms of language structure. So if you're interested in that, I'm happy to send you the paper. It's just been accepted at Language, Cognition, and Neuroscience, but there's a preprint up with its most recent version. But what this experiment really told us was that there are a few implications in terms of clinical implications, which we'll talk about in a second, but that as language is more limited, you obviously are going to have a more limited language structure available to you, which will manifest itself as tasks looking very similar in terms of structure. For those of us interested in the clinical implications, that basically means when you're looking at someone with very severe aphasia or a very severe lexical retrieval issue, it may not be the best use of time to collect data for all of these different tasks if you're looking to see a comprehensive scope of language structure, because you might not see that. You might not have to spend that much time doing that. But on the other hand, if you are looking at someone with less severe aphasia and you do want a comprehensive view of what they're able to produce, it is a great idea to use multiple tasks. And the reason I say that is that that is not what's done at the moment in hospitals. It's not what's done in most research. Typically one task is done and it's a picture description task. And I get why that is. It's a pain to collect and it's a pain to transcribe, code, and analyze. But I hope that this work, along with some of the other stuff we're doing, makes it really clear that one task doesn't tell you everything about someone's language structure, certainly doesn't tell you about the functionality of their language either. So that's what we're really working on in that focus group that I put earlier, is trying to create things that will allow people in the clinical field to use more than one task without running into a huge barrier of time or resources. So I think it's also a great thing to realize that even though we're in discourse, there's lots and lots of different ways to look at discourse, and we need to take that into account in terms of the cognitive mechanisms too. I'll talk a little bit more about this with gesture. I know many of you are interested in memory. That's not my area, but I'm interested in it to the extent that it affects language. And for those tasks that require a lot of episodic details, typically people have really robust, flowery language. They tend to really dig deep and get very interesting, complicated language structures with episodic, when they rely on episodic memory. That could also just be salience, right? Telling that story is important to them. Whereas when you put a picture in front of someone's like, why am I going to spend my time doing this? And they also don't have to dig deep into something like episodic memory, right? They can rely more on semantic memory as well as object recognition, honestly, to do the task. So that's why I really am a big proponent of using multiple tasks like this to get a better glimpse at language structure. And that's not a revolutionary idea. Linguists have been doing this for hundreds of years. It's just the fact that this is not done actively in aphasia, and I think it's a disservice not to do so. So we're really working on making tasks as well as analysis protocols that overcome the barrier of time and lack of resources to allow people to really do good assessments like this. Any questions on this one?
I have a question, but it
Hi,
might
Dan.
be, it might be that this is based on me misremembering the findings, so maybe I don't have a question. Can you go back to the slide? This is from earlier about the dissociation between semantically related and unrelated errors.
There's my computer. There we go.
Yes. So in connected speech, they make more semantically unrelated, right?
We do.
And so the example you gave, which I'm sure is unrepresentative, is that when someone wants to say cookie jar and they say hair instead, I'm assuming in the picture there is a person reaching for the cookie jar and they have hair, right? So they are related. So my question is, are these other words that are using related to the picture, just not to the object that they're trying to describe? Or is it really unrelated? Like, is it just that there are more competitors, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you're thinking about the cookie theft, there is hair in the picture, as you know. We try and say that it's either thematically or taxonomically related to the target. And that does get really hard when you know that there are other things that they could see in the picture. Typically, yeah, that is kind of a bad example, isn't it? But we would classify that as being unrelated, honestly, to the target. I think that's the important part. It's not unrelated to the picture, but it's a competitor that wasn't squashed in trying to reach the target. But it does get really difficult to target any type of an error when you've got less constrained tasks like Cinderella even, or the stroke story, because you really have no idea what they're going for. So it becomes incredibly difficult to match paraphasias with targets well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think another reason though, and you said this too, was people make fewer semantically related errors in discourse because they can talk around it. They can circumlocute really well, right? In naming, you're not allowed to do that. They say, produce a single word. In picture naming or in picture descriptions, you'll see people say, he's trying to get that thing that you eat that has chocolate in it that my mom used to bake for me as a kid, rather than make a mistake and say something instead of cookie. So that's something really interesting that I haven't figured out how best to quantify yet. And it might just have to do with a way of getting around competitors in terms of semantic or phonological.
We should talk about using word embeddings to look at maybe the path in like meaning space when they try to get to something. But
Yeah,
anyway,
that'd be cool.
Samantha has a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can't pull it up on my end.
I think it might just be answered. Samantha, did you have a follow-up on that, or did that cover it?
Whoops, sorry, I was muted.
I was like, I can't see anything. Okay.
Implicit, yes.
Yeah, no, so I think just really quickly, that covered like the second part, but for items that are higher in the hierarchy, or maybe like, maybe there's like a picture of a tree that's sort of like a, in quotes, general tree, but they give an example that's more specific. Like how do you handle those kinds of situations?
Yeah, we generally, it's a great question. So there's tons of different types of semantic errors you can make, right? You can go far too deep and call a car like a very specific model of Corvette that came out in the 70s, or you can say this is a vehicle, right? Those are both right. We would actually, for our purposes and how we code, we wouldn't code either of those as a semantic error. We allow for that spectrum of attempts, and that's just because of what we've figured out over the time with coding and aphasia that keeps us kind of the most reliable. But I think in adults without aphasia, it is incredibly useful to code things based on how close they are to the target. So if they're if they're over the target, right, they're kind of like one category up, or if they're one category specific. I think that is really useful. And I know a lot of groups do that, like Matt Lambenrau from Cambridge definitely does that in some of his individuals with temporal lobe epilepsy, I believe.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if you could do that, but like with a semantic distance thing, so seeing like how high up in the hierarchy, right, or how
yeah, that would be very interesting.
Much further down. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, and I wonder too if I wonder how much a pattern would show up, or if that's also something we run into is we don't know these individuals' language before they have a stroke, right? That's always an issue is this person just a very specific speaker? I say this because my dad always wants to participate in these, and he'll probably watch this, but he's a great storyteller and he'll give lots and lots of details and be very specific about what he's talking about. But then you'll get individuals who use the most broad terms possible, even in a picture description, like this guy and this woman go over there, versus this husband and this wife walk to this yard. So you get a lot of variability, but I think it would be interesting to look at distance.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? We're going to switch gears a little bit. So any more language questions?
There's another one in the chat.
Oh, I can't see the chat. Can someone read it to me?
I can read it. If someone can talk around a target word in discourse, could we regard them as having successfully communicated? Are there ways of measuring success in communication?
Yes, yes, and yes. That's the big thing with, I was trying to kind of get at that we're only looking at structure, not function. So function is whether or not they communicate what they're actually meaning to do. And the ways that we look at that, there's a few rating scales that we typically use. One's called the Communicative Effectiveness Inventory or rating scale. Another way that we'll do this is just a perceptual rating that has high reliability amongst listeners. So we'll run this, we'll run someone's story past two students who are not used to hearing someone with aphasia, and we'll ask them to tell us what they think they heard. And if they're both if they both agree, right, we consider that a reliable judgment. There's a lot of different ways to look at that. Another way to look at kind of meaning over structure is to look at main concepts, which is the work of Jessica Richardson and Sarah Grace Dalton, who have looked at, what do neurotypical controls typically say during this picture description? What are the themes? And then you can kind of do a little checklist whether or not the people with aphasia hit those two. But function's easily the hardest thing to quantify.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Are the patients aware that they're making errors?
Depends. Those individuals who have pretty good auditory reception skills, so individuals with Broca's aphasia typically are aware that they're making errors. Many of them will try and retrace, maybe not successfully, but they'll give it an attempt. Many of those individuals we consider as being more of the receptive type of aphasias may not be aware. That awareness also really inhibits therapy progress in a lot of those more severe receptive aphasias because they're not aware of when they're making an error. And so it's very hard for them to convince them that it is an error and that they should be aware of it. Yeah, you see a far few retracings in those individuals.
Those in the discourse, are they going around a word because they know the word that's coming to mind is wrong, or just no words coming up at all?
It's hard to say. My gut feeling is more the latter. Some of the ways that individuals get around this, where it might be the former, is that they carry a picture book with them of common words that they use, and they will actually flip to what they're trying to say and point to it, at which point you can get a little bit more idea of what they're going for. In some individuals, writing or drawing, it can be relatively intact. So they might be able to write what they want to say, even though they can't say it. But in more severe, more receptive aphasias, typically it's the latter, where they may not even know what they're going for or be aware of what they're going for. They might know, they might not be aware of. These are great questions. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit. So this has been a more recent thing in my lab that I'm really excited about and pursuing a bit more currently with a few students, and that's gesture and what it can tell us about the language system, as well as why it's important to look at in aphasia. Gesture has a long history in neurotypical adults, especially in kids. I mean, Golden Meadow, McNeil from University of Chicago have done fantastic work in gesture. This is not a new area by any means, but in terms of neurogenic communication disorders, it's received relatively little by way of importance. And that's because there are quite a few therapies out there that, for instance, constraint-induced language therapy, which doesn't allow for any other mode of communicating except to speak. It doesn't allow writing, it doesn't allow gesturing, doesn't allow drawing. And that's this idea that if you disallow these other things, you force the speaking to occur. And so these kind of ideas have really gotten us away from looking at gesture a little bit. So I'm trying to get back there because I think it does show us some really important things. So again, we're kind of going to stay in the discourse middle here, and we're going to stay with task, but we're going to look a little bit more at gesturing, and I'll tell you what I mean about gesturing. So this is work from McNeil back in the 90s. He's done fantastic stuff. This is called Kindon's Continuum. He named it after Adam Kindon, which is another gesture scholar. I'm going to focus on these gesticulations, which are in blue here. We usually differentiate them based on whether the gesture holds meaning or not. I'm interested in the ones that hold meaning, which are iconic, metaphoric, and dectic, which you can see here outlined, or I guess underlined in purple. Iconic is where you are either pretending to be something, you're pretending to see something happen, or you're referencing something into the space around you. Metaphoric is like having an abstract thought and representing that like this being thinking. And concrete dectic is by far the easiest to score. It's usually a pointing finger, pointing at concrete things on the body in the room that they want to refer to. I'm not going to talk about beats too much. Beats are typically associated with prosody, so you'll read a lot more about that in kind of right hemisphere disorder, but I'll focus mostly on these more meaning ones. So in terms of meaning-laden gestures, we know that people with aphasia rely on gestures in general more, not just meaning-laden ones, all different types of gestures, far more than neurotypical controls and those with right hemisphere damage. And I've got a few examples of that later. But it remains unclear whether gesture does facilitate language and how. Here are three really popular models on the right, which Firesign published back in 2006. They are by far very well accepted models of gesture, but they talk about how gesture interacts with language in very different ways. Whoa, I meant to move my little Zoom screen and not go forward.
I have a quick question from the chat for you.
Yeah.
From Alessandra, kind of random question, but do we see aphasia in individuals that communicate solely through ASL?
Yes, there is signed aphasia. It is rare, but they demonstrate semantic errors. They demonstrate phonological errors. So in signed language, some of their, not phonemes, but some of their, I guess, phonemes are, place on the body. So like a sign up here is different from a sign down here, hand shape, and then motion, right? And so you can see paraphasias based on like wrong place on the body, but right hand shape, for instance. So signed aphasias do exist. Good question. Over here, I just wanted to point out kind of where some of these disagreements are occurring. So this is a popular model by Krauss. It's called the lexical retrieval model. And he hypothesizes that gesture planning directly basically facilitates lexical access. There's a direct link there. Other models are less sure about this. One of the models by Hadar and Butterworth, which is fairly popular, and then by DeRieder, which is actually close to the McNeil model, they don't think that gesture directly facilitates language. They think it's kind of indirect. So this one, you can see gesture planning really is just a byproduct of mental imagery, and language relies on mental imagery. In this one, you can see that gesture directly affects this concept from where language also originates. So they're less direct. There's a lot of evidence supporting all of these in neurotypical adults, which makes it confusing. But I think aphasia is a really interesting thing to look at because you have a distinct impairment in lexical access. That is the core impairment. So any use of gesture can tell us a little bit more about these models. Also, that's my dog in the background, apologies. So let's look a little bit more at what's going on here. So in the two studies I'll talk about, one of them is going to look at the role of task and how that affects gesturing, especially these meaning ones. And then I want to go into what we're currently looking at and what I'm super excited about, which is why they're using gesture. What is it actually doing for them in terms of language? So in this first task, this was spearheaded by an undergrad. She's a rock star. She went to Aphasia Bank and she took two tasks that had pretty different cognitive and task requirements. One had a picture and was a descriptive task. One didn't have a picture and was the procedural task that I talked about earlier, the how to make a sandwich one. And she found individuals who gestured at least once on both of these tasks and produced a meaningful gesture at least once on both of these tasks. So that was her inclusion criteria. And what she found when she looked at that, number one, hugely heterogeneous in terms of the number of meaningful gestures that were produced. But number two, there seemed to be a task effect. So for the task that had a picture and that was more descriptive, they produced fewer gestures at a lower rate. For the task that was more procedural, where they had to describe how to do something to someone, they produced more gestures at a higher rate. So that was the first thing that she was very excited about, right? Similar to what we're finding in structure of language, tasks are different. And she was interested because if we're going to figure out how to access a person's comprehensive gesture vocabulary, we need to probably do quite a few different tasks to get at that. And she's going into speech language pathology school right now and very interested in kind of doing that. So then we asked, does this provide any evidence for some of those hypotheses I just talked about? What we see is that a higher rate of meaningful gestures associates with language fluency, when I mean fluency, I don't mean stuttering. I mean the actual fluency based on how many times they pause over 3 seconds, how many false starts they make. So they start a word and then they stop it. How many or how fast they speak, so words per minute. Those individuals who gestured at a higher rate spoke a lot slower and had a lot more of those pauses and false starts and fragments. So it seemed that, at least to us, this meaningful gesturing was a form of overcoming a retrieval issue that they were having. We also wanted to say, let's look outside of the task for a metric of language fluency. So we went to the standard metric of language fluency, which kind of categorizes individuals with lower language and higher language fluency. And we saw the same thing. So it's not just within task that this happens. It's the individuals who have overall lower language fluency who are producing a higher rate of iconic gestures, or in this case, it was iconic meaning gestures. I do want to mention though, producing gestures like the frequency didn't associate with fluency at all. It was the rate at which they were produced that associated with the fluency. So for us, this was really interesting from a task perspective, and because there are a few reasons why this might have happened, why gestures might have differed. One is the common ground hypothesis. Melissa Duff's group at Vanderbilt does a lot in this with hippocampal amnesia patients and now traumatic brain injury, where if you share a common ground or a common knowledge, you don't have to gesture as often. You just don't rely on it as much because you make assumptions that the person can kind of see what you're talking about. So in the window task, the picture was visible to both experimenter and speaker. They had a shared common ground, whereas in the sandwich task, they didn't. So that could have been one explanatory variable. Cognitive and linguistic demands were very different. I talked about that a little bit earlier. But then another thing could be spatial language. So this has been looked at in neurotypicals a lot. If the language itself is highly spatial, like put this on that, move this over there, which is like the sandwich task, tends to associate with more of these meaning gestures. So any of those things could be associated with why our individuals with aphasia were gesturing so much more often on the sandwich task. In terms of disfluency, there weren't really big effects of task there. It seemed like individuals who were less fluent were relying on these meaning gestures at a higher rate, regardless of task. That might change if we look at more tasks and more people. But at the moment, that seems to be the picture. In general, it seems like people are using these meaning gestures to overcome some aspect of disfluency. So I think it lends some support for a more direct line of gesture to language, but I think a lot more constrained and experimentally constrained tasks have to be done to really make that connection well. And the last one I want to leave people with, sorry, my dog is angry. The last one I want to leave people with is this idea of informational relationship. So what actually is the gesture doing to the speech or helping with regarding the speech? We looked at a lot of people in Aphasia Bank and also some right hemisphere damage, individuals with right hemisphere damage. This is another part of the Talk Bank project. There are far fewer of them, but it's growing. We looked at 2 tasks again. I've mentioned these, and again, meaning gestures. And what we wanted to say was what role is the gesture actually playing? And some of the research in child gesturing has done a fantastic job of looking at that. So Jana Iverson at Pitt looks at this a lot, Golden Meadow as well. So I've given you an example here of a dectic gesture, which is pointing at the shoe or the foot. So you're referencing something concrete in the environment. If they said she was wearing shoes and pointed, the gesture is redundant with speech. It's not adding anything to it. It's not clarifying anything that's going on there. If they did that gesture and then they said either of these 3 things, which are all very real examples, she was wearing, what are those? Point. That's adding something to the speech. We now know that they mean shoes or feet, right? They didn't say that, but they were clearly searching for it. She was wearing red ones. They're clarifying that the ones means shoes. Or in an error, right? She was wearing socks. They were retelling about Cinderella. Cinderella didn't wear socks. So we know that pointing at the shoe means they were clarifying to mean shoe or slipper. So that's what we're interested in. Is the gesture redundant or is it supplementary? when we look at aphasia, let me just orient you. So these things down here are just gesture types. It's okay if we don't remember what they are. The general pattern is there. People with aphasia produce a lot of different meaningful gesture types, much more than their right hemisphere cohort that they're being compared to over here on the right. So this is column organized, right? Right hemisphere is down, aphasia is down. And it seems that at least the task matters a little bit. You can see the stroke story down here seems to be producing a little bit higher in terms of frequency for some of these gesture types, and more people are producing it. So in the dectic gesture, 132 are producing it during the stroke story, but only 68 produce it during Cinderella, for example. In the right hemisphere group, you can see that people are producing more types of these meaning gestures in the stroke story than they are in the Cinderella story. Okay, frequency, that's interesting, but not information relationship yet. So let's talk about the cool part. Information relationship, what I want us to look at first is dark green, organized in the same way. Aphasia is down on the left column, right hemisphere on the right column. Green is redundant with speech, not adding anything in particular with speech. Tends to be about 60 to 80% redundant regardless of gesture type. This is kind of an oddball down here, this dectic gesture. I don't know what's going on with that one, but almost all of the other ones, about 60 to 80% redundant. The cool one is this pink, which is supplementary to, adding, disambiguating, clarifying. Neurotypical controls almost never do this. A lot of their meaning gestures are redundant. In one study I read, it was over 98% were redundant. So clearly in the aphasia group and the right hemisphere group, they're using gestures like this to supplement what they cannot find or what they're not sure they're clear about. So that adds a whole lot more to why they gesture so often, right? Frequency was interesting, but now we know why, right? They're supplementing a lot more than individuals who are neurotypical and age matched, right? They've done this in older adults as well, and they don't typically gesture in a supplementary way as much. The other thing I want to point out, and I think it's better on this next slide, is that the aphasia group had a lot more of these gray at the top. Those are unclear relationships. We don't know, we cannot say with reliable rater agreement what the relationship between gesture and speech was. That could be because the speech was unintelligible, we couldn't understand it. If it was someone who was incredibly severe and was talking with very empty language, really difficult to know what they were referring to in terms of the speech. So you'll see a lot more of those unclear in the aphasia group than you do in the right hemisphere group. I don't think we had any in the right hemisphere group. So that's something to keep in mind, is that there's a lot of maybe up to 20% of gestures that can be unclear in the aphasia group. So while it's really interesting that they tend to supplement a lot more, there is this issue of trying to identify the relationship that needs a little bit of work in this area. So just to end on this kind of gesture area and why I think it's interesting, I think it can tell us a lot about cognitive load. It can tell us about if they have the concept, if the gesture is accurate, or it tells us something else about the speech. It might tell us a little bit more about a pre-language concept that they have and whether or not that's correct, especially if we know what they're trying to talk about. What else I think is very interesting is something looking at longitudinal recovery from stroke. If language has a direct connection to gesture, as Krauss might think it does gesture at the acute stage tell us anything about language recovery at a later stage? Right? I think that's a really interesting question that no one's asked. And hopefully now that I've said it on video, no one else will ask it. But I think it's really interesting. It's also really hard to do because it's in a longitudinal sample that you need to follow individuals. I also think you need to do more constrained gesture tasks, like here's a picture, tell me a gesture that goes with it, alongside spontaneous gesturing, so you can really get a comprehensive viewpoint of what individuals are able to produce. I think that's about it from me. Some takeaways, right? Task matters. I think it's cool to go into the wild, but it's a thorny path, but we're getting there. Gesture is important for understanding a bit more about language and in general communication, right? Which is a little different than language. And I think knowing all of these things will actually improve what we're currently doing for individuals with aphasia. We know that behavior therapy like speech therapy works. There's been lots of evidence to show that. We still don't know why. We don't know what cognitive mechanisms are necessary for someone to respond to a certain type of therapy, what linguistic therapy is good for what linguistic impairment. We're still very much focused on that and unclear in the field. And I think having a better picture of how things generalize to discourse and then to conversation is important, and also how gesture can tell us a little bit about what they might have cognitively that we can leverage. So these are all the reasons why I'm really interested in this, and hopefully we'll improve this area in the future. I'll just leave it on here and we can ask questions about the gesture slide. This is the dog that is clawing at my door at the moment. She's up there reading one of my papers.
We have one question.
Okay.